Imagine you're a king, right? Used to absolute power, and then suddenly you're forced to wear the symbols of a revolution you just absolutely despise. A mob is breaking into your palace. They're forcing you to drink to their cause while they're brandishing a heart on a pike.
Yeah.
Now, this isn't some, gruesome horror movie. This was the reality for King Louis VI back in the summer of 1792.
Right.
And this is just one of, the many shocking events we're going to be unpacking today as we kind of deep dive into this pivotal period in the French Revolution.
It's a crazy period, isn't it? This time when like all these ideals of liberty, equality are clashing with, war and economic crisis, political intrigue.
Right.
You've provided some really gripping excerpts from the Rest is History podcast, focusing on this particular summer. And I think we can really shed some light on how a revolution that was meant to bring enlightenment kind of descended into this chaotic period.
Yeah, I think so. So let's set the stage. France has declared war on Austria in April of 1792, expecting a swift victory, right?
Yeah.
They envisioned this domino effect. The Austrian Netherlands are going to welcome them as liberators, but what they got instead was a swift lesson in humility.
Yeah, absolutely. Humility is a good word. I mean, the French army was in complete disarray at this point. The revolution had just eroded discipline. Soldiers didn't trust their officers, some of whom were, aristocrats.
Right.
And this just resulted in a string of defeats.
Right.
I mean, embarrassing defeats. There are accounts of soldiers literally running away from battle, shouting every man for himself.
Wow.
Some even went so far as to fire their colonel out of a cannon.
They what? Fired their colonel out of a cannon.
Yeah.
And that's a level of mutiny I hadn't quite pictured.
Well, it highlights how the old order had completely crumbled. These revolutionary ideas, they permeated the army, but without proper leadership and structure, you just can't mount an effective campaign. I mean, if the Austrians had been more decisive at this point, they probably could have just marched on Paris and ended the revolution right there.
So we've got military blunders on one hand, but what's happening back home in France?
Yeah.
Were the people rallying behind the war effort?
Not really, no. I mean, the economic situation was terrible. Inflation was soaring, food was scarce.
Yeah.
And people were starting to, feel that the revolution had promised them more than it could deliver.
Right.
And, this discontent created just this fertile ground for these radical voices to emerge.
You're talking about those firebrand journalists, guys like Jean-Paul Marat and Jacques-René Hébert.
Yeah.
With their penchant for inflammatory rhetoric and, some creative name-calling.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. They published these papers that stoked the flames of anger and paranoia.
Yeah.
Louis VI, in their words, was a fat pig, completely out of touch with the people.
Yeah.
Marie Antoinette, meanwhile, an Austrian, let's just say they didn't have kind words for her either.
Yeah. So they're painting this picture of a royal family actively betraying the revolution from within.
Exactly. And to make matters worse, Prussia joins Austria in the war effort around this time. So this only served to heighten the sense of fear and paranoia that was just gripping the nation.
Was there any truth to these accusations? I mean, was the royal family actually working against the revolution?
Yeah. That's a complex one, isn't it?
Yeah.
And we know Louis VI was in contact with Austria, but his motivations are still debated. Some argue he was desperately trying to preserve the monarchy. Others see it as a genuine betrayal of the French people.
Right.
Regardless of intent, though, the perception of treachery was very real, and it really fueled the revolutionary fervor.
And sealed his fate.
Yeah, I think you could say that.
So we've got a nation at war, we've got economic hardship, and we've got a growing belief that the king himself is a traitor.
Yeah.
Sounds like a powder keg waiting to explode.
It was. And explode it did. On June 20, 1792, a mob made up largely of the sans-culottes. They were the working-class Parisians. They were the ones bearing the brunt of the economic crisis. They stormed the Tuileries Palace.
This is the event we alluded to at the start, right?
Yeah.
Mob forcing Louis to wear the revolutionary bonnet.
Exactly. They broke into the palace. They forced him to don the red bonnet, that symbol of the revolution.
Right.
Forced him to drink a toast to the nation's health. It was this symbolic humiliation, a way of demonstrating that the people held the true power.
And how did Marie Antoinette, how did she react to this intrusion?
Well, unlike Louis, who seemed paralyzed by indecision, she actually faced the mob with defiance.
Really?
Yeah, she refused to back down, even when they threatened her and her children.
Well,
So while they narrowly escaped physical harm, I mean, this event left the royal family deeply shaken.
yeah.
They were effectively prisoners in their own
I
palace.
mean, it must have been a terrifying ordeal, knowing that your own people had turned against you so violently.
Yeah. It really highlights the volatility of the situation, doesn't it? I mean, the revolution had unleashed these forces that were becoming increasingly difficult to control.
Yeah.
And then, as if things couldn't get any worse, enters the Marquis de Lafayette.
Lafayette, the hero of the American Revolution.
Yeah, the very same. Lafayette, seeing the chaos engulfing France, believed that he could be the one to restore order.
Hmm.
He fancied himself like a modern-day Julius Caesar coming to save the Republic. Problem was, he returned to Paris without any troops. He just expected the National Guard to simply flock to his banner.
That seems a little naive, to say the least. What was he thinking?
Well, he definitely misjudged the mood of the people, and he overestimated his own popularity. His plan backfired spectacularly. The National Guard didn't rally to his cause. Even Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, who despised Lafayette, refused to support his attempted coup.
Wow. So instead of saving the day, he further isolates the monarchy and paints himself as completely out of touch.
Exactly. His failed coup just weakened the monarchy further and emboldened those radical elements within the revolution. By July, France was on the precipice, the war was going badly, the economy was in shambles, and political authority was rapidly disintegrating.
So what happens next? With everything falling apart, where do the revolutionaries go from here? So we've got the French Revolution teetering on the brink, war, economic turmoil, and the king himself looking, well, unreliable, to say the least. You mentioned that radical voices were getting louder. What were they calling for at this point?
Well, by this point, it was no longer about reforming the monarchy. It was about replacing it. The radical clubs and journals, they were openly advocating for a second revolution, one that would sweep away all those, vestiges of the old regime and establish a true republic.
It's incredible how quickly the goals shifted. Just a few years ago, most people would have been happy with a constitutional monarchy, limit the king's power a little bit. Now they're talking about completely overthrowing the monarchy. What caused such a drastic shift?
I think a few things happened. First, that constant threat of war, it created the sense of urgency, desperation. People wanted decisive leadership, and they weren't finding it in Louis XVI.
Right.
Then second, the economic hardship. That fueled anger and resentment toward the monarchy, which was seen as, out of touch, indifferent to the suffering of the people.
Yeah.
And then third, the radical journalists. They were masters at shaping public opinion. They presented this really compelling narrative, betrayal, conspiracy, convincing people that the king and queen were enemies of the revolution.
So it's almost like the revolutionaries' own paranoia about enemies within helped create the conditions for a second revolution.
That's a really good point. The fear of counter-revolution, internal enemies sabotaging the revolution, it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. They saw enemies everywhere, and their actions, driven by that fear, ultimately led to the very instability they were so worried about preventing.
So the monarchy is teetering, radicals are calling for a second revolution, and then comes the Duke of Brunswick's manifesto.
Yeah.
Can you remind us what that was and how it played into all of this?
Sure. So the Duke of Brunswick, he was leading the Prussian army that was advancing on Paris. And in July of 1792, he issued this manifesto. It was basically an ultimatum. He said if any harm came to the royal family, Paris would be destroyed.
You'd think that would scare the revolutionaries into, backing down. I mean, here's this powerful army threatening to level their city.
You would think so, but it had the opposite effect. The revolutionaries, the radical factions in particular, they saw it as foreign interference, a blatant attempt to prop up the monarchy, which they hated.
Right.
So instead of intimidating them, it just enraged them. They felt like they had nothing left to lose.
So the Brunswick Manifesto, it kind of backfires and gives the radicals the push they needed to launch their second revolution.
Exactly. It was intended to protect the monarchy, but it became the catalyst for its downfall. It confirmed their suspicions that the king was in league with foreign powers, and it just created this sense of urgency, a now or never mentality.
And this all leads to the insurrection of August 10th, 1792. This is a day that's going to go down in history, isn't it?
It was. It was a day that changed the course of the French Revolution for sure. The people of Paris, led by these radical figures like Georges Danton, they rose up in armed rebellion. They formed this new revolutionary commune, took control of the National Guard, and then they marched on the Tuileries Palace.
And what about Louis XVI and his family during all of this?
Well, they were in a pretty perilous position, weren't they? Lost the support of the people, the army, even their own guard.
Yeah.
Their only option was to flee to the Legislative Assembly, try and seek protection.
And did the assembly offer them sanctuary?
Well, they let them into the building, but their power was waning pretty rapidly at this point. The insurgents, they controlled the city, they surrounded the assembly, and, well, they demanded the king's deposition.
So even though he seeks refuge, he's essentially a prisoner.
Exactly. And as the insurgents closed in, the Swiss Guard, who were tasked with defending the Tuileries Palace, made a desperate last stand.
And that leads to that bloody confrontation you mentioned, the one witnessed by Napoleon Bonaparte.
Yeah. Napoleon, who was a young artillery officer at the time, he witnessed the whole thing. He later described the sheer hatred directed at the Swiss Guard, how they were massacred despite having surrendered. It was a brutal and chaotic scene. You know, it was a real testament to the anger and violence that had been unleashed.
So what happens after the attack? What becomes of the monarchy?
Well, the assembly, they were horrified by the bloodshed, and now fearing for their own safety, they had no choice but to give in to the demands of the insurgents. They suspended Louis XVI, essentially ending the monarchy, and called for the election of a national convention to decide, the future of France.
It's incredible to think that in a matter of months, France went from a constitutional monarchy to a king being stripped of all his power.
The revolution took a decisive turn. The power of the monarchy was broken, and the future of France, well, it rested in the hands of the people, or at least, those who claim to speak for them.
But that's not the end of the story, is it? We've still got the war with Austria and Prussia, and it feels like things inside France are far from settled.
Yeah.
What happens next? We left off with the French monarchy, essentially decapitated, a new national convention about to convene, and war still raging on France's borders. What happens next in this, whirlwind of a revolution?
Well, as you can imagine, regicide isn't exactly a recipe for making friends among Europe's monarchs.
Right.
Executing Louis VI sent shockwaves through the continent. Austria, Prussia, Britain, Spain, they all saw the French Revolution as this dangerous threat, and they formed a coalition determined to crush it.
So France is facing a multi-front war against some of the most powerful nations in Europe. That seems like an impossible situation.
It was a dire situation, to be sure. The odds were stacked against them, but the revolutionaries, they were fueled by this fervor that's, it's hard to comprehend unless you were there. Remember all those volunteers who flocked to Paris in the summer of '92?
Right.
They became the backbone of this new revolutionary army, driven by patriotism and a belief in the ideals of the Republic.
It's amazing how how external threats can sometimes unify a nation.
Yeah.
This idea of being surrounded by enemies, fighting for their survival, it seems to have galvanized the French people.
Exactly. It's that classic rally around the flag effect. And the revolutionaries, they were masters of propaganda. They knew how to exploit this. They painted the war as this, fight for liberty against tyranny, a struggle for the soul of France. And this narrative, it helped to create a sense of national unity.
Yeah.
It inspired these incredible acts of courage and sacrifice.
But this period also saw the rise of what we call the Reign of Terror. It seems almost paradoxical that a revolution fought in the name of liberty and equality would descend into such horrific violence.
It's a dark chapter in the story of the French Revolution. It continues to, fascinate and horrify us. The Committee of Public Safety, led by figures like Robespierre, they took control of the government and instituted this reign of terror to purge any perceived enemies of the revolution.
So who were these enemies? Who was targeted during the terror?
Well, it started with those suspected of counter-revolutionary activities, royalists, nobles, priests who refused to swear allegiance to the new government.
Okay.
But then it just spiraled out of control. Anyone who disagreed with the committee, even moderately, could be branded a traitor and face the guillotine.
It's a stark reminder of how revolutionary ideals, however noble, can be they can be twisted to justify horrific acts. How did it get so out of control?
I think there's the constant pressure of war. That created a sense of emergency. this belief that extreme measures were necessary. And then there was the internal dynamic within the revolutionary leadership itself. The Jacobins were divided, suspicious of each other, constantly vying for power.
Right.
And so this led to these purges and accusations, with each faction accusing the other of betraying the revolution.
It's a vicious cycle.
It was.
And then there's Robespierre. He seems to be a central figure in this descent into terror.
Yeah, Robespierre is a complex figure, a brilliant lawyer, an eloquent speaker, and a true believer in the ideals of the revolution. But he was also ruthless and uncompromising. He believed that terror was necessary to create, a virtuous and just society.
Mm.
He saw the revolution as this moral crusade, and those who stood in its way, even those who had once been his allies, were obstacles to be eliminated.
So fueled by wartime paranoia and these internal power struggles, the terror spirals out of control.
Mm.
How does it end? Does France manage to survive this internal and external chaos?
It does, but at a terrible cost. The terror, like all reigns of terror, eventually consumed itself. Robespierre's grip on power tightened, his paranoia grew, and, he just saw enemies everywhere. Finally, in July of 1794, a coalition of his opponents in the National Convention, fearing for their own lives, organized a coup. Robespierre was arrested and executed, along with many of his followers.
So the revolution devours its own children.
Yeah, you could say that.
What's the ultimate legacy of this tumultuous period? Is the French Revolution ultimately seen as a success or a failure?
Well, that's a question historians still debate today. It's a mixed legacy, for sure, full of contradictions. On the one hand, it achieved some remarkable things. It abolished feudalism, proclaimed the rights of man and citizen, established a republic based on, the principles of popular sovereignty. But it also descended into bloodshed and tyranny. It left deep scars on French society.
It's a cautionary tale. The complexities of revolution, how the pursuit of noble ideals can sometimes lead to, unintended and even horrific consequences.
It is. The French Revolution reminds us that progress is rarely linear, that revolutions are messy and unpredictable, and that even the most well-intentioned movements can be, corrupted by power and fear.
Well, it's a story full of drama, intrigue, betrayal, and sacrifice. It reminds us that history isn't just a collection of facts and dates. It's a tapestry woven from human passions, ideals, and flaws. And the French Revolution, with its soaring triumphs and its tragic descent into terror, remains one of the most compelling and relevant stories in human history.
Absolutely. And it's a story that still resonates with us today. It reminds us of the fragility of freedom, the importance of vigilance, and the enduring power of human aspirations for a better world.
Well, there you have it. A deep dive into one of the most fascinating and consequential periods in human history. We explored the tumultuous summer of 1792, the fall of the monarchy, the rise and fall of the terror, and the enduring legacy of the French Revolution. We hope you found it insightful, engaging, and thought-provoking. Remember to subscribe to The Deep Dive for more explorations of history's most fascinating moments, curated just for you.